What began as a routine stop at the Crossroads truck stop in rural Idaho quickly turned into a night that would be remembered for years. When 12 members of the Desert Ravens motorcycle gang decided to harass a quiet man drinking his coffee alone, they had no idea they were messing with a highly decorated Force Recon Marine veteran, a veteran who was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun was setting behind the Sawtooth Mountains, painting the Idaho sky in deep shades of orange and purple as evening settled over Interstate 84. The Crossroads truck stop stood like a beacon of light against the growing darkness, its bright fluorescent signs illuminating the massive parking lot where dozens of semi-trucks were lined up for the night. The digital clock above the diner entrance read 7:15 p.m., and the familiar scent of diesel fuel mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling burgers drifting from the kitchen. Inside the truck stop's well-lit diner, the evening crowd was starting to thin out. A few long-haul truckers occupied the worn leather booths, some finishing their meals while others nursed cups of coffee before heading back to their rigs. Behind the counter, Linda, the night shift waitress who'd been working at Crossroads for over 2 decades, moved efficiently between customers, her coffee pot never seeming to run empty. In the corner booth, partially hidden by a display of local tourism brochures, sat Michael Hayes. To most observers, he appeared to be just another traveler, a man in his late 40s wearing worn jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots. His gray-streaked hair was cut short, and a neatly trimmed beard covered his weathered face. Nothing about his appearance suggested anything remarkable, except perhaps for his posture, straight-backed but relaxed, with an awareness of his surroundings that most people wouldn't notice. What the casual observer wouldn't know was that beneath Hayes's quiet exterior lay 20 years of Marine Corps experience, including 15 years in Force Recon. The simple silver wedding band on his finger and the small laptop bag beside him gave no hint of the 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, or the countless classified operations he'd led across the globe. Now retired from active duty, Hayes worked as a security consultant, traveling between clients and preferring to keep a low profile. The diner's radio played softly in the background, some country song about lost love and long highways, while the occasional burst of laughter came from a group of local farmers seated at the counter. Outside, the steady rhythm of trucks coming and going continued as it had for decades at this major stopping point between Boise and Salt Lake City. Linda approached Hayes's table, coffee pot in hand. "Need a refill, hun?" she asked, already knowing his answer. He'd been stopping at Crossroads every few months for the past 2 years, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and the house special meatloaf. She'd never learned much about him, but she liked his quiet politeness and the way he always left generous tips. "Thanks, Linda," Hayes replied with a slight smile, pushing his cup toward her. As she poured, they both heard the distant rumble of motorcycles growing louder, approaching from the eastern highway. The sound was different from the usual truck engines, sharper, more aggressive, with the distinctive roar of modified exhaust pipes. Through the large windows, the parking lot's bright lights revealed a pack of motorcycles turning off the interstate. Their chrome pipes and leather-clad riders gleamed under the fluorescent glow as they approached the truck stop. The bikes moved in formation, their riders wearing matching black leather vests with elaborate patches, the mark of an organized motorcycle gang. Inside the diner, conversations began to quiet. The local farmers at the counter exchanged knowing looks while a young family quickly paid their bill and headed for the door. Linda's hand tightened slightly around her coffee pot as she watched 12 motorcycles pull into the lot, their engines drowning out the country music before falling silent all at once. Hayes didn't move from his booth, but his eyes tracked the bikers through the window's reflection as they dismounted. Their leather vests displayed the Desert Ravens patch, a notorious gang known for causing trouble across 3 states. The gang's reputation for violence and intimidation had grown over the past year, with local news reports linking them to various incidents at truck stops and small towns along the interstate. As the bikers approached the diner's entrance, Hayes took another sip of his coffee. His expression remained neutral, but his awareness had shifted. A subtle change that only someone with similar training might notice. The peaceful evening at Crossroads truck stop was about to change, though no one could have predicted just how memorable this night would become. The bell above the diner door chimed, and the first of the Desert Ravens stepped inside, bringing with them the cold autumn air and the smell of leather and exhaust. The quiet evening was over, and what happened next would become a story told at truck stops across America for years to come. One building on our opening, I'll now craft part 2, focusing on character development and background while maintaining the tension. The Desert Ravens filed into the diner with the practiced swagger of men used to commanding attention. Their leather boots thudded heavily against the worn linoleum floor as they spread out, some taking seats at the counter, while others leaned against the walls, effectively surrounding the dining area. Their leader, a massive man who went by Reaper, stood near the entrance, his arms crossed over a vest covered in patches declaring his status. Linda had seen their type before in her 20 years of working nights at Crossroads. She knew the routine. They'd make noise, intimidate customers, maybe break something, and eventually move on. But something felt different this time. The Ravens had been getting bolder lately, and rumors of their recent activities had even the veteran truckers choosing alternate routes. In his corner booth, Hayes continued eating his meatloaf, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The skills that had kept him alive through countless operations didn't disappear with retirement, and right now those skills were telling him everything he needed to know about the 12 men who had just entered. Their formation, their positioning, the way they assessed the room. These weren't just weekend warriors playing at being tough. The Desert Ravens had earned their reputation. Behind the counter, Linda tried to maintain her professional demeanor as she approached the bikers seated there. "What can I get you boys?" she asked, her voice steady despite her unease. The nearest Raven, a younger man with a skull tattooed on his neck, grinned up at her. "Coffee all around, sweetheart, and make it quick." His tone carried an edge that made the simple order sound like a threat. Hayes observed the scene through the reflection in his window, noting details that others might miss. The gang's patches told a story: territory claims, ranks, earned privileges. Their weapons were concealed but present. The slight bulges under leather vests weren't lost on someone with his training. Two of the Ravens stationed near the door were scanning faces, likely looking for rival gang members or law enforcement. The few remaining customers in the diner tried to focus on their meals, heads down, avoiding eye contact. A middle-aged trucker sitting at the counter quietly paid his bill and left, careful to move slowly and deliberately. The local farmers had already slipped out the back door, leaving cash on the counter for their meals. The tension in the air grew thicker with each passing moment. Through the window, Hayes could see the Ravens' motorcycles arranged in a disciplined formation in the parking lot. These weren't just random troublemakers. Their organization spoke of structure, hierarchy, and experience. The bikes themselves were well-maintained machines, customized for both show and performance. This was a group that took their identity seriously. As Linda delivered coffee to the bikers, Hayes noticed how the gang members watched her movements, their eyes following her with predatory interest. He saw her hands trembling slightly as she poured, trying to move quickly without appearing rushed. The young cook in the kitchen, barely visible through the service window, had stopped pretending to work and was watching the scene with obvious concern. Hayes's military training had taught him to read situations, to analyze threats and calculate responses before they were needed. Right now, those instincts were telling him that this evening could go bad in any number of ways. He'd seen it before, not just in combat zones, but in places like this, where a wrong word or a misinterpreted look could spark violence. The diner's radio continued playing softly, now broadcasting a weather report predicting overnight storms. Outside, the parking lot had grown quieter as word spread about the Ravens' presence. The steady flow of customers had stopped, with travelers choosing to pass by rather than risk an encounter with the notorious gang. 20 years in the Marines, 15 in Force Recon, had taught Hayes patience. He'd learned that rushing into situations only made them worse. So he continued eating his meal, each bite measured and calm, while his trained senses remained alert to every movement and sound in the diner. His position in the corner booth gave him clear sightlines to both exits and most of the dining area, a choice that hadn't been accidental. Linda made her way back behind the counter where she picked up the phone and quietly dialed the owner's number. Hayes noticed how she kept her voice low, though he could guess what she was saying. Local law enforcement's response time to the truck stop was typically 20 minutes at best. A lot could happen in that time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The ravens had spread themselves throughout the diner, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Their loud conversations and occasional bursts of laughter carried undertones of menace. They were marking their territory, establishing dominance over the space. It was a tactical move that Hayes recognized from his years of experience. Control the environment, intimidate the civilians, establish superiority. What the ravens couldn't know was that they were being assessed just as carefully as they were trying to assess others. Hayes's decades of military experience had taught him to notice details others might miss. The way the gang's hierarchy played out in their seating arrangements, the subtle signs of who actually gave orders versus who just talked loud, the hints of weapons concealed beneath leather vests. The evening was balanced on a knife's edge, with tension building by the minute. Everyone in the diner could feel it, that peculiar electricity in the air that precedes trouble. But while others saw only the surface threat of 12 tough bikers, Hayes saw deeper patterns, reading the situation with the expertise of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with dangerous men in dangerous places. The first signs of real trouble began when Reaper, the Ravens' leader, pushed himself away from the wall and began a slow walk around the diner. His heavy boots echoed against the floor as he moved, making a deliberate show of inspecting his surroundings. The other bikers watched their leader's movement with anticipation, like wolves waiting for a signal from their alpha. Linda had retreated to the far end of the counter, pretending to organize menus while keeping a nervous eye on the situation. The young cook, Jimmy, had disappeared entirely into the kitchen, though the sound of dishes being washed provided a strange backdrop to the growing tension. The few remaining customers sat frozen in their seats, caught between fear of drawing attention and fear of making themselves targets by trying to leave. Hayes continued his meal without looking up, though his awareness had sharpened. He noted how Reaper's path through the diner was steadily bringing him closer to the corner booth. It wasn't a coincidence. The gang leader had been watching Hayes since they entered, likely annoyed by his lack of visible reaction to their presence. The rumble of thunder in the distance seemed to underscore the mounting tension. Through the large windows, flashes of lightning illuminated the parking lot, where the Ravens' motorcycles gleamed wetly in the first drops of rain. The weather was changing, matching the darkening mood inside the diner. Two of the Ravens at the counter began deliberately spilling sugar across the surface, watching with amusement as Linda's hands trembled while she cleaned up their mess. Another biker knocked his coffee cup to the floor, the crash of breaking ceramic drawing sharp intakes of breath from the remaining customers. "Oops," the biker sneered, making no move to help as Linda hurried over with a dustpan. "Guess I'm just clumsy tonight." His companions laughed, the sound harsh and artificial in the tense atmosphere. Hayes set down his fork, his meal finished. His movements were unhurried as he reached for his coffee cup, but his muscles had subtly tensed. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize the signs of impending violence, the shift in body language, the escalating provocations, the testing of boundaries. Reaper had completed his circuit of the diner and now stood at the end of Hayes's booth, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. The gang leader's vest was adorned with patches declaring his status, President of the Desert Ravens, earned through violence and feared across 3 states. "Something interesting in that coffee, old man?" Reaper's voice carried across the now silent diner. "Must be, the way you've been sitting here ignoring your betters." The other Ravens had stopped their individual harassments, all attention now focused on their leader's confrontation. Lightning flashed again, closer now, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder that rattled the diner's windows. The storm was almost directly overhead, nature's own dramatic accompaniment to the scene unfolding inside Crossroads. Hayes took another sip of his coffee before responding, his voice calm and measured. "Nothing interesting in the coffee, just trying to enjoy a quiet meal. His tone was neutral, neither challenging nor submissive, the voice of a man stating simple facts. Reaper's face darkened at the lack of fear in Hayes' response. He planted both hands on the table, leaning forward to loom over the seated man. Maybe you don't understand the situation here, Pops. This is Raven's territory now. Everything that happens here happens because we allow it. The other gang members had begun to move closer, forming a loose circle around the booth. Their boots scraped against the floor as they positioned themselves, the sound mixing with the steady drum of rain now beating against the diner's roof. Through the reflection in the window, Hayes noted their positions without turning his head. 12 men, all armed at least with knives, some likely carrying more serious weapons. Their positions showed training, crude but effective. They were used to overwhelming their targets with numbers and intimidation. Linda had backed against the far wall, her hand clutching the phone she'd used earlier to call for help. But help, if it was coming, was still at least 15 minutes away. The storm would slow response time even further, and the Ravens knew it. Actually, Hayes replied, finally looking up to meet Reaper's gaze, I understand the situation perfectly. His voice remained calm, but something in his eyes made the gang leader straighten slightly, an unconscious reaction to a warning his instincts recognized, even if his conscious mind didn't. The tension in the diner had reached a critical point. Every person present could feel it, that electric moment before a storm breaks, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and distant lightning illuminated the scene in brief, harsh flashes. What happened next would depend on choices that would have consequences reaching far beyond this stormy night at a truck stop in rural Idaho. The peaceful evening had evolved into something else entirely, and everyone present was about to learn a valuable lesson about appearances and assumptions. 3. The storm outside intensified as Reaper straightened to his full height, clearly agitated by Hayes' calm demeanor. Rain drummed against the diner's windows, and occasional flashes of lightning cast harsh shadows across the scene. The other Ravens had positioned themselves strategically around the booth, their leather vests creaking as they shifted with anticipation. You think you understand? Reaper's voice carried a dangerous edge. He reached down and picked up Hayes' coffee cup, deliberately pouring the remaining liquid onto the table. Let me make it clearer for you, old-timer. When the desert ravens show up somewhere, people show respect, they show fear. Hayes watched the coffee spread across the table, his expression unchanged. His eyes, however, tracked every movement in the diner with the precision of someone who had spent decades evaluating threats. Through the window's reflection, he could see 2 ravens blocking the main entrance. Another 3 had positioned themselves between his booth and the kitchen exit. The remaining gang members had spread out to control the space, following a pattern they'd clearly used before. Linda had managed to quietly usher the last few regular customers toward the back door, away from the building confrontation. The young cook, Jimmy, peered nervously through the kitchen window, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The only sounds were the storm outside and the heavy breathing of 12 agitated bikers. You boys seem to have a peculiar way of earning respect, Hayes commented, his voice carrying across the now empty diner. He carefully folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate, the deliberate movement drawing confused looks from some of the younger ravens. Where I come from, respect is earned through actions, not intimidation. Reaper's face darkened with anger. He leaned forward again, his massive arms braced on the table, bringing his face close to Hayes's. Maybe where you come from, old man, people are soft. Out here, respect comes from knowing who's in charge, and right now you're sitting in my territory, disrespecting me and my brothers. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the patches on Reaper's vest, including one that read, "No mercy given." The thunder that followed seemed to emphasize his words, rattling the diner's windows in their frames. 2 of the younger ravens had moved to the counter, deliberately knocking over the napkin dispensers and condiment bottles. The crash of glass and metal against the floor made Linda flinch, but Hayes didn't even blink. His attention remained focused on Reaper, though he was acutely aware of every movement in the diner. Territory? Hayes' voice carried a hint of something that made several of the ravens shift uncomfortably. I've known men who died protecting real territory, defending their homes, their families, their country. What you're doing here isn't about territory. It's about bullying people who you think can't fight back. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Some of the older ravens exchanged glances, picking up on something in Hayes' tone that their younger companions missed. There was an authority in his voice that didn't come from volume or threats. It came from experience. Reaper straightened again, his face contorting with rage. "You got a big mouth for an old man sitting alone against 12 of us?" He gestured to his men, who began to close the circle tighter around the booth. "Maybe it's time we taught you about the real world." Hayes finally moved, pushing his plate aside with a deliberate slowness that seemed to unnerve some of the younger ravens. "Last chance," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Reaper's. "Take your men and leave. Find somewhere else to prove how tough you are." The rain continued to pour outside, creating a steady backdrop to the confrontation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces set with anger and anticipation. In the kitchen, Jimmy had finally gathered enough courage to reach for the phone, though he knew help would take too long to arrive. "Last chance?" Reaper laughed, the sound echoing off the diner's windows. "You hear that, boys? The old-timer's giving us a last chance." The other ravens joined in the laughter, though some of them seemed less certain, picking up on something in Hayes' demeanor that gave them pause. Through the window's reflection, Hayes watched as one of the younger ravens reached under his vest, likely for a weapon. The movement confirmed what his training had already told him. This situation was about to turn violent. He had hoped to avoid it, but sometimes conflict finds you no matter how hard you try to prevent it. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked-about incidents in the truck stop's history. In the next few moments, 12 members of the Desert Ravens would learn a harsh lesson about judging people by their appearance, and the quiet man in the corner booth would demonstrate why combat experience trumps street reputation every time. The confrontation at Crossroads reached its breaking point when one of the younger ravens, emboldened by his leader's swagger, grabbed Hayes' laptop bag from the booth. "Let's see what the old-timer's carrying," he sneered, starting to unzip the bag. "Maybe he's got something worth taking." Hayes' voice cut through the tension like a steel blade. "Put that down." The words weren't loud, but they carried such authority that the young biker's hands froze on the zipper. Even some of the older ravens straightened unconsciously, responding to a tone they'd never heard in their leader's voice. "Or what?" Reaper demanded, though something in Hayes' demeanor had finally triggered his survival instincts. The massive gang leader shifted his weight slightly, a subtle tell that Hayes' combat-trained eyes didn't miss. "You gonna take on all of us by yourself, old man?" Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark contrast. Rain continued to pound against the windows and thunder rolled overhead, but inside the diner, the air had grown preternaturally still. Linda had pressed herself against the far wall, her hands clutching a phone she knew wouldn't bring help in time. Jimmy watched wide-eyed from the kitchen, all pretense of work abandoned. "I'm going to say this one last time," Hayes spoke, his voice carrying the weight of countless combat operations. "Put the bag down, get on your bikes, and ride away. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight." As he spoke, he slowly began to rise from the booth, his movements measured and controlled. The ravens closest to Hayes unconsciously took a step back, responding to something their instincts recognized even if their conscious minds didn't. Years of street fights had taught them to read opponents, and something about this man's movements set off warning bells they couldn't ignore. Reaper, however, had too much pride invested in this confrontation to back down now. "Get him, boys," he ordered, reaching for Hayes himself. "Show this old-timer what happens when you disrespect the Desert Ravens." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. As Reaper's massive hand swung toward him, Hayes moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. His right hand caught Reaper's wrist, and suddenly the gang leader was flying through the air, crashing into two of his own men before landing hard against the counter. The young raven holding the laptop bag swung it like a weapon, but Hayes was no longer where he had been. A precise strike to the biker's solar plexus left him gasping on the floor, the bag dropped and forgotten. 3 more ravens rushed forward together, confident in their numbers. Hayes moved through them like water through rocks, each movement efficient and purposeful. The first biker's punch met empty air as Hayes stepped inside his guard, a quick series of strikes leaving him slumped against the wall. The second caught an elbow to the jaw that sent him spinning into the third, both of them crashing into a booth. "Jesus Christ," Linda whispered from her position by the wall, watching as the quiet, regular customer transformed into something else entirely. His movements weren't wild or aggressive like street fighters she'd seen before. Every action had purpose, every strike calculated for maximum effect with minimum force. 2 more ravens pulled knives, the blades glinting in the fluorescent light. Hayes didn't even seem concerned. He caught the first attacker's wrist, twisted, and suddenly the knife was in his own hand. The second knife wielder backed away quickly, dropping his blade and raising his hands. Reaper had regained his feet, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, watching as another of his men went down to a perfectly executed throw that left him breathless on the diner floor. Hayes didn't bother responding. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades honing his skills in real combat situations. Each attack from the ravens was met with a precise counter that left them wondering what had hit them. None of his movements were flashy or theatrical, just brutally efficient responses that neutralized threats with minimal damage. The remaining ravens had backed away, forming a loose circle around Hayes but no longer eager to test their luck. Even Reaper, who had built his reputation on never backing down, seemed unsure of how to handle this situation. His men were scattered across the diner floor, none seriously injured but all thoroughly defeated by this seemingly ordinary man. Thunder crashed outside, punctuating the scene as Hayes stood calmly in the center of the chaos he'd created. Not a single chair had been broken, not a single window smashed. The only real damage was to the Ravens' pride and their reputation as the toughest gang in 3 states. The rain continued to drum against the windows, providing a soundtrack to the aftermath of what would become a legendary encounter. In less than a minute, the quiet veteran had systematically dismantled 12 hardened bikers, and he hadn't even broken a sweat. Hayes stood motionless in the center of the diner, his stance relaxed but ready as he surveyed the scattered ravens around him. Some were slowly getting to their feet, while others remained on the floor, groaning and reassessing their life choices. The storm outside continued its assault, rain pelting against the windows as if nature itself was applauding the display of skill they'd just witnessed. Reaper pushed himself up from where he'd landed, his face a mask of confusion and wounded pride. Blood trickled from his nose, and his carefully maintained image of invincibility had been shattered in mere seconds. The other ravens looked to their leader, waiting to see how he would handle this unprecedented defeat. "Now," Hayes spoke, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held throughout the encounter. "We can either end this here, or we can continue. But I should warn you, what you've seen so far has been me holding back." He picked up his laptop bag, checking it for damage before slinging it over his shoulder. "Your choice." Linda watched from behind the counter, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. In 20 years of working at Crossroads, she'd seen her share of fights, but nothing like this. The precision, the control. It was like watching a master craftsman at work, except his craft was combat. Thunder rolled overhead as Reaper struggled with his decision. His reputation, built over years of intimidation and violence, hung in the balance. The younger ravens looked to him for direction, while the older ones seemed to be edging toward the door, having seen enough to know when a situation was beyond their abilities. What are you?" Reaper finally managed, his voice lacking its earlier bravado. He touched his bleeding nose gingerly, wincing at the pain. The question seemed to hang in the air, echoing what everyone in the diner was thinking. Hayes adjusted his flannel shirt, which hadn't even become untucked during the brief but intense confrontation. Just a Marine who's seen enough bullies in his time. His eyes met Reaper's, and this time, the gang leader looked away first. "Force Recon taught me how to handle myself, but more importantly, it taught me when not to fight. You boys should have taken that option when I offered it." The revelation of Hayes' military background sent murmurs through the conscious ravens. Force Recon was legendary, and suddenly their opponent's incredible skills made sense. They weren't dealing with some random old-timer. They'd picked a fight with someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of combat in real-world situations. Jimmy emerged cautiously from the kitchen, his young face filled with awe as he surveyed the scene. Bikers were scattered across the diner floor, some still trying to regain their breath, others nursing injuries that would serve as reminders of this night for weeks to come. Yet nothing was broken. No windows smashed, no furniture destroyed. The only real casualty was the Desert Raven's reputation. "Here's what's going to happen," Hayes continued, his voice pitched to carry to every corner of the diner. "You're going to pick yourselves up, apologize to Linda for the mess and disturbance, pay your bills, and leave. Then you're going to spread the word that Crossroads truck stop is off limits to troublemakers. Understood?" Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark clarity. The defeated bikers, the amazed staff, and Hayes standing calmly in the center of it all. The thunder that followed seemed to emphasize his words, nature adding its own exclamation point to his declaration. Reaper looked around at his beaten crew, then back at Hayes. The gang leader's face worked through a series of emotions: anger, humiliation, and finally, a grudging respect. "Boys," he called out, his voice rough, "do what the man says. We're done here." One by one, the Ravens picked themselves up. They moved gingerly, their bodies reminding them of the swift education they'd received in underestimating quiet veterans. Each made their way to the counter, placing money for their coffee and any damage they'd caused. A few even managed mumbled apologies to Linda, who watched in astonishment as the formerly intimidating bikers shuffled past like scolded schoolchildren. Hayes returned to his booth, sitting down as calmly as if nothing had happened. He picked up his coffee cup, noticed it was empty, and caught Linda's eye. "Could I get a refill, please?" he asked politely, his voice carrying the same gentle tone it always had during his regular visits. The last of the Ravens filed out into the rain, the sound of their motorcycles starting up seeming somehow less aggressive than when they'd arrived. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had transformed from one of terror to something approaching awe. The storm continued outside, but within Crossroads, a different kind of peace had been restored. 6. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the diner like dust after a storm. The sound of motorcycle engines faded into the distance as the Desert Ravens retreated into the rainy night, leaving behind only scattered sugar packets and the lingering scent of leather and defeat. Linda approached Hayes' booth with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands now steady as she poured. "I've seen a lot of things working here," she said, shaking her head in amazement. "But nothing quite like that." She gestured at the security cameras mounted in the corners. "Wait till my husband sees this footage. Nobody's going to believe it without proof." Hayes accepted the fresh coffee with a polite nod. "Best if not too many people see that footage," he suggested quietly. "Sometimes the thread of a story is more effective than proof." His eyes met Linda's, and she understood. The mystery would make the tale even more powerful. The young cook, Jimmy, had emerged fully from the kitchen and was collecting scattered condiment bottles and napkin holders from the floor. His movements were energetic, almost excited, as he kept glancing at Hayes with undisguised admiration. "Sir," he finally gathered the courage to speak. "That was like something out of a movie. Where did you learn to move like that?" A small smile crossed Hayes' weathered face. 20 years in the Marines teaches you a few things," he replied modestly. "Force Recon isn't big on fancy moves, just what works, what keeps you and your team alive." He paused, considering his next words carefully. But the most important lessons weren't about fighting. They were about when not to fight. The sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing louder as local law enforcement finally approached. The storm had begun to ease, the thunder now a distant rumble, though rain still fell steadily outside the windows. The diner's fluorescent lights seemed brighter somehow, as if the earlier shadow of menace had physically lifted from the space. "They're about 15 minutes too late," Linda commented, referring to the approaching police. She'd started wiping down the counter, restoring order to her domain. Though I suppose it's better than not coming at all. The familiar routine of cleaning seemed to help her process what she'd witnessed. Hayes nodded, sipping his coffee. Might be worth giving them a somewhat edited version of events, he suggested. No need to make extra paperwork for anyone. His tone was casual, but Linda caught his meaning. Some stories were better left simplified. The first police cruiser pulled into the lot, lights flashing against the rain-slicked pavement. Deputy Sarah Martinez stepped out, hand resting cautiously on her holster as she approached the diner's entrance. Her face showed the concern of someone who'd heard about the Desert Raven's presence and expected to find chaos. Instead, she found a surprisingly orderly scene. Beyond some scattered sugar packets and overturned condiment bottles, the diner looked normal. Linda met her at the door, already prepared with a simplified version of events. Yes, the Ravens had been there. No, there hadn't been any real trouble. They'd left peacefully after being asked to move on. Hayes remained in his booth, quietly finishing his coffee as Linda handled the situation. Through the window's reflection, he watched Deputy Martinez survey the scene, obviously trying to reconcile the calm diner with the reports of a dozen notorious bikers causing trouble. Jimmy, still buzzing with excitement, had to be silenced with a look from Linda before he could launch into his own dramatic retelling of events. The young cook settled for cleaning with unusual enthusiasm, occasionally shooting admiring glances at Hayes. More patrol cars arrived, their lights painting the rainy parking lot in alternating red and blue. Officers gathered under the awning, comparing notes and looking somewhat confused by the apparent lack of damage or disturbance. The story they were getting didn't quite match what they'd expected to find. Throughout it all, Hayes maintained his calm demeanor, giving no indication that he'd just single-handedly dealt with 12 members of one of the most notorious biker gangs in 3 states. He finished his coffee, left his usual generous tip, and gathered his belongings with the same quiet efficiency he showed on every visit. As he stood to leave, Linda touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning far more than just his tip. "Will we see you again?" There was a hint of concern in her voice, worry that this incident might drive away one of her favorite regulars. Hayes smiled, a warm expression that softened his weathered features. "Same time next month," he assured her. "Best meatloaf between here and Salt Lake City." He adjusted his laptop bag on his shoulder, nodded to Deputy Martinez and headed for the door. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle as Hayes stepped outside. The parking lot lights created halos in the mist, and the air smelled clean and fresh after the storm. As he walked to his truck, he could hear Linda already beginning to manage the story, turning what could have been a tale of violence into something more nuanced, a lesson about respect, judgment, and the quiet strength that some people carry within them. Word of what happened at Crossroads spread through the trucking community like wildfire over the next few days. The story grew with each telling, though the core truth remained constant. 12 Desert Ravens had walked into the wrong truck stop and challenged the wrong man. By the end of the week, variations of the tale could be heard at every diner and rest stop along Interstate 84. Local radio stations picked up the story, though they kept the details vague. A confrontation between a motorcycle gang and a veteran at a truck stop had ended decisively in the veteran's favor. Without security footage or official police reports to reference, the incident took on an almost mythical quality in the retelling. Linda found herself at the center of it all, her diner counter becoming an unofficial gathering place for those wanting to hear a first-hand account. She told the story carefully, emphasizing the veteran's restraint and professionalism rather than the violence. "He tried to talk them down first," she'd explained to eager listeners. "That's what impressed me most. He gave them every chance to walk away." Jimmy, the young cook, had a harder time containing his excitement. His version of events, shared enthusiastically during breaks, tended to grow more elaborate with each telling. "You should have seen how he moved," he'd say, occasionally attempting to demonstrate what he'd witnessed until Linda would call him back to the kitchen. The Desert Ravens' absence from their usual haunts didn't go unnoticed. Other motorcycle clubs in the region began hearing stories about how the notorious gang had been humbled by a single man at a truck stop. The tale spread through biker bars and gatherings, gaining new details, but always maintaining its central message about underestimating quiet veterans. Deputy Martinez found herself fielding calls from other law enforcement agencies in neighboring counties, all curious about what had really happened that night. She stuck to her official report, a potential disturbance that had resolved itself peacefully before police arrival. But privately, she'd heard enough from Linda and others to know that something extraordinary had occurred. Truckers began detouring to stop at Crossroads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious veteran. Linda would just smile and say he was a regular customer, nothing more. She'd learned the value of mystery from Hayes himself, understanding that sometimes the suggestion of a story was more powerful than its details. A week after the incident, a local newspaper ran a small article about the changing atmosphere at area truck stops. Without mentioning the confrontation directly, it noted that reports of motorcycle gang activity had decreased significantly. The piece quoted anonymous sources describing a renewed sense of security among travelers and truck stop employees. The Desert Ravens themselves maintained an uncharacteristic silence about the incident. Reaper and his gang had virtually disappeared from their usual territory, though rumors suggested they were regrouping and reconsidering their approach to maintaining their reputation. Some said the gang leader had been seen asking questions about Force Recon Marines, showing an unexpected interest in military training. Local business owners noticed the change first. The subtle tension that had always accompanied the Ravens' presence in town had lifted. Regular customers who had been staying away began returning to their usual routines, no longer worried about running into trouble with the notorious gang. At the truck stop, Linda had instituted a new policy: a free cup of coffee for any veteran who stopped by. It was her small way of honoring what Hayes had done, though she never explicitly connected it to that rainy night. The gesture sparked a trend, with other businesses in the area beginning to show similar appreciation for military veterans. Jimmy had started taking evening self-defense classes at the local community center, inspired by what he'd witnessed. "I don't want to learn how to fight," he explained to Linda. "I want to learn about discipline and control, like that Marine showed us." His enthusiasm had inspired several other young people to join him. The security footage from that night, while never publicly released, had become something of a legend among the truck stop's employees. Linda kept it secured away, showing it only to her husband and Deputy Martinez. "Some things are better left to the imagination," she'd say when asked about it. "The story means more when people have to fill in the details themselves." Even the weather seemed to have shifted after that night. The storm that had provided such a dramatic backdrop to the confrontation had cleared the air, ushering in a period of unusual clarity and calm. Truckers commented on how the stars seemed brighter at night, the air fresher, as if nature itself was celebrating the change in atmosphere. The incident had sparked something larger than just a single confrontation. It had become a reminder that strength didn't always announce itself with loud voices and aggressive posturing. Sometimes, real power lay in the quiet confidence of those who had nothing to prove, who carried their capabilities with humility and used them only when necessary. As the days turned into weeks, the story continued to evolve, but its essence remained unchanged. It had become more than just a tale about a veteran teaching some troublemakers a lesson. It had become a parable about judgment, respect, and the unexpected ways that change could come to a community. 3 weeks after the incident, an unexpected visitor arrived at Crossroads during Linda's evening shift. Reaper, the Desert Ravens leader, walked in alone. He wasn't wearing his leather vest with its intimidating patches, just a plain black jacket. His nose still showed signs of his encounter with Hayes, but it was his demeanor that had changed the most dramatically. Linda tensed when she saw him enter, but Reaper raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Just came to talk," he said, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "And to make things right." He walked to the counter slowly, conscious of how his previous visit had ended, and sat down on one of the stools. "Coffee?" Linda asked cautiously, her hand steady as she held the pot. The diner was relatively quiet, just a few regular customers who watched the scene with obvious interest. Word of the incident had spread so widely that everyone recognized the former terror of the highways. "Please," Reaper nodded, placing a folded envelope on the counter. "This is for the damages and trouble from last time, with some extra to cover everyone's tabs from that night." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup Linda poured, staring into the dark liquid as if searching for words. Jimmy peered out from the kitchen, his eyes wide as he recognized the biker. The young cook had been regaling new customers with the story of that night for weeks, though his versions had grown increasingly elaborate. Seeing Reaper in person, humbled and alone, added a new chapter to his tale. That Marine, Reaper finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the hushed diner. He did more than just beat us that night, he taught us something. Been doing a lot of thinking since then. He took a sip of coffee, wincing slightly as the cup touched his healing nose. Linda leaned against the counter, curiosity overcoming her caution. "What kind of thinking?" she asked, noting how different this man seemed from the intimidating figure who had led his gang into her diner 3 weeks ago. "About strength. Real strength," Reaper replied, meeting her eyes for the first time. "We thought being tough meant making people fear us. But that Marine, he showed us what real power looks like. Controlled, disciplined. He could have really hurt us, but he chose not to." The rain had started again outside, a gentle autumn shower that painted the windows with running rivulets. The sound provided a soft backdrop to Reaper's words as he continued to share his revelation. "Been looking into Force Recon since that night," he admitted. "Learning about what those Marines go through, what they stand for. Made me realize we've been doing it all wrong. Acting like bullies instead of earning real respect." Linda refilled his coffee cup, noting how other customers had gone quiet, listening to the former gang leader's words. The story of that night had already become local legend, but this edition, the return of a humbled adversary, added a new dimension. "The Ravens are changing," Reaper continued, pulling out his wallet and showing Linda a newly acquired motorcycle safety instructor certification. "We're still riding, still a brotherhood, but we're doing it different now, using our reputation to help people instead of scare them." As if to illustrate his point, he described how the Ravens had recently escorted a funeral procession for a local veteran, standing guard to ensure the family's privacy. They'd also started organizing charity rides for children's hospitals, channeling their organizational skills toward positive goals. "That Marine showed us there's more than one kind of strength," Reaper explained, his weathered face thoughtful. "Been trying to teach that to my younger guys. Some got it right away, others took more convincing, but we're all learning." Jimmy had edged closer to hear better, his usual energy subdued by the unexpected scene playing out before him. The story he'd been telling for weeks was gaining an epilogue he never could have imagined. "We're not looking for recognition or forgiveness," Reaper clarified, finishing his coffee. "Just wanted you to know that something good came from that night. That Marine did more than just teach us a lesson about fighting. He showed us a better way to be strong." Linda picked up the envelope he'd left, noting its weight. "I'll make sure this gets distributed properly," she assured him. "And thank you for coming back to make things right. That takes its own kind of strength." Reaper stood, leaving money for his coffee alongside a generous tip. "If that Marine comes back through," he said, pausing at the door, "tell him thank you. Not just for sparing us when he could have done real damage, but for showing us what we could be instead of what we were." As he walked out into the rain, Linda watched him mount a motorcycle that was noticeably quieter than before. The intimidating gang leader they'd feared had been replaced by someone seeking a different kind of respect, the kind that had to be earned through actions rather than fear. The diner remained quiet for a moment after he left, the only sounds being the gentle rain and the soft clinking of coffee cups. Then the conversation started again, but now there was a new chapter to add to the story of the night when a Force Recon Marine had changed more than just one confrontation at a truck stop. 1 month after the incident, exactly as promised, Hayes returned to Crossroads for his regular visit. The diner had changed subtly in his absence. New security lights illuminated the parking lot more brightly, and a small Veterans Welcome sign had appeared near the entrance. Inside, newspaper clippings about reduced gang activity in the area had been discreetly posted on the community bulletin board. Linda spotted him first as he walked in, noting how he performed the same subtle scan of the environment that she now recognized as a habit born from years of training. The diner was busier than usual for this time of evening, word having spread about when the quiet veteran typically made his appearances. "Your usual booth is waiting," she called out, already moving to pour his coffee. The other customers tried to appear casual while stealing glances at the man whose actions had transformed their community. Hayes seemed either not to notice or, more likely, had chosen to ignore the attention. As he settled into his corner booth, Linda brought over his coffee and meatloaf without being asked. "Had an interesting visitor while you were gone," she mentioned, placing the plates down carefully. "Big fellow, broken nose, came to make amends. Asked me to pass along his thanks." Hayes nodded slightly, his expression revealing nothing. "Good to hear," he said simply, though his eyes showed he understood the significance. Sometimes people just need a reason to change direction. They usually know when they're on the wrong path. Jimmy emerged from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pie he'd baked specifically for this evening. The young cook had spent the past month practicing his culinary skills with the same dedication he now showed in his self-defense classes. "Sir," he said, placing a slice of pie next to Hayes' coffee. "On the house, and thank you." The veteran accepted the gesture with a quiet smile, recognizing it for what it was, not just gratitude for his actions, but appreciation for the example he'd set. "How are those evening classes going?" he asked, having heard about Jimmy's new interest through Linda's updates. "Really good, sir," Jimmy replied enthusiastically. "Instructor says I'm learning fast. Says the most important thing is control and discipline, just like you showed us." The young man's chest swelled with pride as he shared his progress. Throughout the evening, regular customers came and went, each offering their own subtle acknowledgments. A respectful nod, a quiet, "Thank you for your service," a cup of coffee anonymously paid for. Hayes accepted each gesture with the same humble grace he'd shown during the confrontation. Deputy Martinez stopped by during her patrol, ostensibly for coffee but clearly timing her visit to coincide with Hayes's. "Crime rates are down 40% since that night," she mentioned casually, while Linda refilled her cup. "Especially around the truck stops. Funny how one incident can change things." Hayes continued eating his meal, listening more than speaking. His presence had the same quiet authority it had shown during the confrontation, but now people understood the depth behind his calm exterior. They saw not just the man who had handled 12 bikers with ease, but someone whose real strength lay in knowing when and how to use his capabilities. A group of truckers at the counter were discussing recent changes in the area. The Desert Ravens, they reported, had been seen escorting elderly veterans to medical appointments, providing security at community events, and organizing charity rides. The transformation of the once feared gang had become as much a part of the story as the confrontation itself. "You know," Linda said quietly as she brought Hayes a coffee refill, "that night changed more than just the Ravens. It changed all of us. Made us remember that strength isn't always about who can throw the hardest punch." Hayes nodded, understanding what she meant. The incident had demonstrated something important about power and responsibility, about the difference between commanding respect and demanding fear. The lessons went far beyond simple self-defense. As the evening progressed, more stories filtered through the diner. Other motorcycle clubs in the region had taken notice of the Ravens' transformation, leading to a broader shift in biker culture throughout the area. The highways felt safer, the truck stops more welcoming. "Going to be heading out on another consultation job soon," Hayes mentioned to Linda as he finished his meal. "But I'll be back through next month, same as always." His words carried a reassurance that despite his role in recent events, he was still just a regular customer who enjoyed good meatloaf and quiet conversation. Before he left, Hayes paused at the counter to pay his bill. The diner had grown quiet, everyone aware of his presence but respectfully maintaining their distance. He left his usual generous tip, nodded to Linda and Jimmy, and headed for the door. "Safe travels," Linda called after him, a phrase that now carried more meaning than just a casual farewell. Hayes raised a hand in acknowledgement as he stepped out into the evening. Just another traveler on the highway to most observers, but something much more to those who knew the truth. The impact of that rainy night at Crossroads continued to ripple through the community in unexpected ways. As autumn gave way to winter, the truck stop became more than just a place to fuel up and grab a meal. It had transformed into a symbol of positive change and unexpected redemption. One cold December evening, Linda arrived for her shift to find the parking lot unusually full. A line of motorcycles was parked neatly in one section, their riders gathered inside the diner. But these weren't the intimidating figures of months past. The Desert Ravens, still led by Reaper, had organized a toy drive for the local children's hospital. "Never thought I'd see the day," the elderly trucker Bob commented from his regular spot at the counter, watching as leather-clad bikers carefully arranged donated toys in boxes. Those same fellows who used to shake down truckers are now playing Santa Claus. Reaper, overhearing the comment, approached the counter with a respectful nod. "Life's funny that way," he said, ordering coffee for his crew. "Sometimes you need someone to show you a better path." His nose had healed, but he wore the slight crook in it like a reminder of the lesson he'd learned. The transformation of the Ravens had inspired other changes throughout the region. Other motorcycle clubs had followed their example, shifting their activities toward community service rather than intimidation. The highways had become notably safer, with truckers reporting fewer incidents of harassment or theft. Jimmy, now assistant manager at Crossroads after his dedication had caught the owner's attention, had started a weekly self-defense class in the truck stop's back parking lot. With help from his own instructor, he taught basic techniques to interested truckers and local residents, always emphasizing Hayes's lessons about control and restraint. "It's not about learning to fight," he'd explained to new students, repeating the words he'd heard that fateful night. "It's about understanding when not to fight and how to handle yourself when you have no choice." Linda had transformed one wall of the diner into what she called the Community Wall of Honor. Among the photographs of local veterans and first responders, she'd placed a simple framed quote, "Real strength is knowing how to use it." Though Hayes's name wasn't mentioned, everyone knew where the wisdom had come from. The local police department had noticed the changes too. Deputy Martinez reported that calls about motorcycle gang activity had dropped to almost zero. More significantly, former troublemakers were now often first to report actual crimes or help stranded motorists. "Had a broken-down minivan on the highway last week," she shared during her coffee break. "Before I could even get there, 3 Ravens had already helped the family change their tire and were escorting them to the nearest service station." The truck stop's reputation had spread far beyond local routes. Drivers would detour hundreds of miles just to stop at Crossroads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the quiet veteran who had sparked such change. Though Hayes maintained his regular monthly visits, he remained as unassuming as ever, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. One evening, a group of young Marines on leave stopped by the diner, having heard the story through the military grapevine. They sat quietly at the counter, listening as Linda shared her version of events, their faces showing understanding of the deeper lessons in the tale. "That's what we train for," one of them commented afterward. "Not to be the toughest or the scariest, but to be ready when needed and to use our skills responsibly." The incident had even caught the attention of veteran support groups in the region. They began using Crossroads as a meeting point, drawn by its new reputation as a place where service members were not just welcomed but understood. The diner became a sort of unofficial halfway house for veterans transitioning back to civilian life. Reaper and his reformed Ravens often participated in these gatherings, sharing their own story of transformation. "We thought we were tough," he'd tell newcomers, "until we met someone who showed us what real strength looks like. Now we're trying to pass that lesson on." The winter wind howled outside the diner's windows, but inside, the atmosphere remained warm and welcoming. Truckers shared coffee with bikers, veterans swapped stories with locals, and the divisions that had once seemed so important had begun to fade. Linda, watching it all from behind her counter, often thought about how one quiet man's actions had catalyzed such profound changes. Hayes hadn't set out to be a hero or to transform a community. He'd simply stood up for what was right, showing both strength and restraint when it mattered most. "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments," she'd say when asked about that night. "All it takes is one person willing to stand up and show others a better way." The story of Crossroads had become more than just a tale of one confrontation. It had become a testament to the power of example, a reminder that real change often starts with a single act of principled strength. The quiet veteran had taught them all that true power lies not in the ability to intimidate, but in the wisdom to know how and when to use one's abilities for good. As winter melted into spring, the one-year anniversary of the incident at Crossroads approached. The truck stop had continued its transformation, becoming a model for how a simple business could help reshape an entire community. Linda and the owner had decided to mark the occasion with a special gathering, though they knew Hayes would probably prefer to avoid any formal recognition. "It's not just about that night anymore," Linda explained to her regular customers as she planned the event. "It's about celebrating how one moment of courage can change everything." The anniversary dinner was scheduled for the exact date of the confrontation, and word spread quickly through the trucking and biking communities. The reformed Desert Ravens, under Reaper's leadership, had volunteered to handle security for the event. It was a gesture rich with irony. The same men who had once threatened the peace now stood guard to preserve it. They wore their leather vests, but the patches had changed. Alongside their original insignia, new badges proclaimed Community Guardians and Veterans Allies. Local businesses contributed to the celebration. The automotive shop donated funds for new lighting in the parking lot. The nearby diner provided extra chairs and tables. Even the town's mayor had agreed to attend, recognizing how the changes at Crossroads had positively impacted the entire region. Jimmy, now sporting assistant manager badges and a newfound confidence, had spent weeks preparing a special menu for the evening. "We're keeping the meatloaf, of course," he insisted, knowing it was Hayes' favorite, "but we're adding some new dishes to mark the occasion." The day of the anniversary dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the stormy night that had started it all. By late afternoon, vehicles began filling the expanded parking lot. Truckers who had adjusted their routes to attend parked their rigs in neat rows. Motorcycles gleamed in the spring sunlight, their riders a mix of reformed Ravens and other clubs who had followed their example. Linda had transformed the diner's interior with subtle decorations. Nothing flashy, respecting Hayes' preference for understated recognition. The community wall of honor had been expanded, now featuring photographs of local veterans alongside stories of positive changes in the area. "Remember," she instructed her staff, "if Hayes shows up, we keep it low-key. This isn't about putting him in the spotlight, it's about celebrating what his example inspired in all of us." Deputy Martinez arrived early, now wearing sergeant's stripes, her promotion partly due to her role in helping manage the positive changes in the community. She brought statistics showing the dramatic decrease in crime rates and increase in community engagement since that fateful night. Reaper and his core group positioned themselves strategically around the property, coordinating security with professional efficiency. Their radios crackled with respectful, measured communications, a far cry from the aggressive posturing of their past. "Never thought I'd be wearing an event security badge," Reaper mused, adjusting his new vest. "But it feels right, you know? Using our skills to protect instead of intimidate." As evening approached, more people arrived. Veterans from across the state, having heard the story through various channels, came to pay their respects. Local families who had once avoided the truck stop now arrived with children in tow, drawn by the celebration's community spirit. The mayor stood near the entrance, greeting arrivals and marveling at the diversity of the crowd. "This is what community looks like," she observed to Linda. "People from all walks of life, coming together because one person showed them it was possible." Jimmy's special anniversary menu proved popular, especially with the truckers who had traveled long distances to attend. The young cook moved between kitchen and dining room, sharing his own version of the story with newcomers while keeping the food flowing smoothly. The atmosphere inside Crossroads hummed with conversation and laughter. Former adversaries sat together, sharing meals and stories. The invisible barriers that had once divided different groups, truckers, bikers, locals, law enforcement, had dissolved in the wake of Hayes' example. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors reminiscent of that transformative night, conversation quieted momentarily as a familiar figure entered the diner. Hayes, true to his routine, arrived for his monthly visit, apparently unsurprised by the gathering. Linda met him at the door with his usual coffee. "You knew about this, didn't you?" she asked, noting his slight smile. "Word gets around," he replied quietly, accepting the cup. "Though I hope nobody's expecting a speech." The celebration continued, but with a natural gravity that pulled everyone into quiet conversations rather than loud festivities. Hayes took his usual booth, and throughout the evening, people approached briefly to share how that night had affected their lives, or simply to offer a quiet thank you. The anniversary gathering at Crossroads became another chapter in the growing legend, but more importantly, it served as a reminder that the most powerful changes often start with the quietest actions. In celebrating that night, they were really celebrating something larger, the capacity for positive transformation that exists in every community, waiting only for someone to show the way. 12. As the anniversary celebration wound down, the gathering transformed into something more intimate and meaningful. Small groups formed throughout the diner, each sharing their own stories of how the events of that night had influenced their lives over the past year. The atmosphere was one of quiet reflection rather than boisterous celebration. Hayes remained in his corner booth, accepting the occasional visitor with grace, but mainly observing the scene before him. Linda noticed how he watched everything with the same quiet alertness he'd shown that first night, though now it was tempered with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "You know," Reaper said, approaching Hayes's booth with 2 fresh cups of coffee, "I've been wanting to have a real conversation with you for a while." He gestured to the empty seat, and at Hayes's nod, sat down. The former gang leader and the veteran Marine created an unlikely picture, sharing coffee in the same space where they'd once faced off. "My boys and I," Reaper continued, his voice carrying none of its former aggression, "we've been studying what happened that night. Not just the fighting, though that was impressive enough, but everything else. The control, the discipline, the choice not to do real damage when you could have." Hayes listened quietly, his eyes occasionally scanning the room out of habit. Around them, the diner buzzed with conversation as other participants in the celebration shared their own stories of transformation. "Changed our whole perspective," Reaper admitted. "Made us realize we were using our strength all wrong. Now we're trying to protect instead of intimidate, help instead of hurt. It's not always easy, but it feels right." Jimmy approached the booth carrying 2 slices of his specially prepared anniversary pie. "Sir," he addressed Hayes, "I wanted you to know that the self-defense classes we started, we're not just teaching techniques. We're teaching what you showed us, about responsibility, about choosing not to fight when you don't have to." Linda watched from behind the counter as more people gravitated toward Hayes's booth, each waiting patiently for a moment to share their story. A young trucker described how the Ravens had helped change his tire in a snowstorm. A local business owner told of how the reformed gang now provided security for community events. Deputy Martinez, now Sergeant Martinez, shared updates about the broader changes in the region. "Other truck stops have started following Crossroads' example," she reported, "creating safe spaces, welcoming veterans, building communities instead of just serving customers." The mayor, who had stayed longer than planned, observed the gathering with obvious approval. "This is how real change happens," she commented to Linda. "Not through laws or force, but through example. One person shows a better way, and others follow." Outside, the spring evening had turned to night, but the parking lot remained full. The Ravens' motorcycles gleamed under the new security lights, their chrome polish reflecting the stars above. The trucks lined up in neat rows seemed to stand guard over the gathering, their drivers inside sharing in the celebration of transformation. As midnight approached, Hayes finally stood to leave. The diner fell quiet as he made his way to the counter to pay his bill, though Linda tried to wave off his money. "Not tonight," she insisted. "Tonight's on the house." Hayes smiled but placed his usual payment and tip on the counter anyway. "Some things shouldn't change," he said quietly. As he turned to leave, Reaper stood and called out, "Attention everyone." The diner fell silent. "A year ago," the former gang leader announced, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "We came here looking for trouble. Instead, we found something else. A lesson about real strength, about using power to help instead of harm. We're not the same men who walked in that night, and for that, we're grateful." Hayes acknowledged the words with a slight nod, then moved toward the door. As he passed through the crowd, people stepped back respectfully, creating a path. Some nodded, others whispered thanks, but no one tried to stop him or make a scene. They understood that quiet dignity was its own form of strength. At the door, Hayes paused and turned back to survey the gathering one last time. The diner was filled with people whose lives had changed because of one night's events. Reformed bikers, confident truckers, empowered staff members, and strengthened community leaders. All because someone had chosen to stand up and show a better way. "Same time next month?" Linda called out, already knowing the answer. Hayes smiled and nodded. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, then stepped out into the night. The bell above the door chimed softly as it closed behind him, and conversations gradually resumed throughout the diner. The anniversary celebration continued for a while longer, but the quiet veteran's departure had marked its emotional peak. People began sharing their hopes for the future, making plans for community projects, and discussing ways to spread the positive changes even further. Linda, watching it all from her familiar spot behind the counter, realized that the legacy of that rainy night went far beyond a single confrontation. It had become a catalyst for transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the quietest actions. 2 years after the incident at Crossroads, the truck stop had become a legend among travelers on Interstate 84. The story had evolved and grown, passed from driver to driver, town to town, but its essence remained unchanged, a tale about real strength, redemption, and the power of quiet courage to transform a community. Linda still ran the night shift, though now she had more help. The diner had expanded, adding a small veterans lounge where former service members could find coffee, conversation, and resources for support services. The wall of photos had grown to include stories of positive changes throughout the region, each one traceable in some way back to that fateful night. Jimmy had been promoted to full manager, his self-defense classes now an official program sponsored by several local businesses. "It's not about fighting," he would tell each new group of students, repeating the lesson he'd learned. "It's about carrying yourself with dignity and knowing when not to fight." The Desert Ravens had undergone the most dramatic transformation. Under Reaper's leadership, they had become something entirely different, a motorcycle club dedicated to community service and veteran support. Their leather vests still commanded attention, but now they brought comfort rather than fear to those who saw them approach. "We keep the name," Reaper explained to newcomers, "to remind us of what we used to be and what we chose to become." The Ravens had established a mentoring program for troubled youth, using their own story of transformation to show others that change was always possible. Hayes continued his monthly visits, though he never sought recognition for his role in the changes. He would sit in his usual booth, eating his meatloaf and observing the fruits of that night's actions with quiet satisfaction. Other veterans often sought him out, not for war stories, but for guidance on finding their place in civilian life. The truck stop itself had become a model for others along the interstate. Companies consulted with Linda and the owner about how to create similar environments of safety and community in their own locations. The Crossroads model, as it became known, emphasized respect, inclusion, and the power of giving people second chances. Deputy Martinez, now Lieutenant Martinez, used the story in her training sessions for new officers. "Sometimes the biggest impact comes from knowing when not to use force," she would explain, describing how one veteran's controlled response had sparked widespread positive change. The local community had flourished in unexpected ways. Crime rates remained at historic lows, while community engagement had soared. The annual anniversary gathering had become a regional event, drawing people from across the country who wanted to see where a single act of principled strength had started a movement. One evening, as storm clouds gathered reminiscent of that transformative night, a young Marine on leave sat at the counter, listening as Linda shared the story once again. "The remarkable thing," she concluded, wasn't just what happened that night. It was everything that happened afterward, how one person's example showed us all a better way. Through the windows, lightning flickered across the sky, illuminating the parking lot where trucks and motorcycles sat side by side. The Ravens security teams patrolled quietly, ensuring everyone's safety with the same dedication they had once used to cause fear. Inside, the diner hummed with the comfortable energy of a place where strangers became friends and past differences were forgotten. Veterans chatted with truckers, former gang members shared coffee with law enforcement, and the invisible barriers that once divided the community had dissolved. You know what the real miracle is? Reaper asked a group of young bikers who had stopped to learn about the Ravens' transformation. It's not that we changed. It's that we were given the chance to change. One man could have destroyed us that night, but instead, he showed us what we could become. The story of Crossroads had transcended its original participants to become something larger, a testament to the power of quiet strength, of choosing wisdom over force, of offering second chances. It reminded people that real change didn't require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, just the courage to stand up for what's right and the wisdom to do it with restraint. Hayes's regular booth had become something of a quiet memorial, respected even when he wasn't there. A small plaque on the wall above it read simply, "Strength isn't about who you can defeat, it's about who you can lift up." The words weren't attributed to anyone, but everyone knew their source. As another year rolled on, the legacy of that rainy night continued to grow and evolve. Each new person who heard the story took away their own lessons, adding to the ripple effect of positive change that had started with one veteran's choice to show strength through restraint. The transformation of Crossroads from a simple truck stop to a symbol of community renewal served as a reminder that the most powerful changes often start in the quietest ways, with one person willing to stand up and show others a better path.